There's a Jewish historian named Alan Segal. He wrote a book called The Two Powers in Heaven. And what he talks about is there's this weird thing happening in the Hebrew Bible where there's almost like two Yahweh figures that they point to. So some verses, for instance, will say like Yahweh rained down fire from Yahweh.
Atheist YouTuber and scholar Alex O'Connor went on Jubilee to sit across from 25 Christians and have them push back on his objections. Now, as you can imagine, he gives several, like the problem of suffering, insufficient evidence for the resurrection in his view. I want to focus on one of Alex's objections, and here's his words: Jesus never claimed to be God. Now, we're going to show a couple people give their responses to that. People who did a good job. And then I want to throw my own thoughts in by, oddly enough, agreeing with him. Now, I want you to stay tuned for what I mean exactly by that, because I think that's very important. But let's get to it.
My next assertion is that Jesus never claimed to be God.
What's up, man? Coley.
Coley. So, talk to me. Where does Jesus claim to be God?
Yeah, so I'm curious, when you say that, are you including the book of John?
So I think that the book of John is probably the least historically reliable in this case. So I'm talking about the historical Jesus.
Yeah.
I do think that there are a number of instances where Jesus appears to claim to be God in John's gospel.
Okay.
But even if we think that he actually said that, I still think that there's reason to believe that he wasn't claiming to be God in the sense of being identical with Yahweh.
When you talk about the historical Jesus, what else do you pull from other than the Gospels of things that he might have said?
The things that he might have said, we only really have the Gospels, but
Okay.
there are multiple sources within the Gospels.
What do you date it at?
Around 70 AD.
Okay, yeah.
I sort of go with the scholarly consensus. And so you have also a bunch of sources, the unique sources to Matthew and Luke.
Yeah.
You also have this potential source called Q
Yeah.
from the German for quell, right? All of this kind of stuff. John comes in the latest.
Sure.
And so when we're trying to figure out what the historical Jesus actually said, if we've got multiple sources all claiming that he said the same thing, then I think we have good reason to think that he actually said that. Claims like, before Abraham was, I am, I and the Father are one, anyone who's seen me has seen the Father, only appear in the Gospel of John, not in any of our other sources, which I think makes them less historically reliable.
Well,
Now, I want to point out, first of all, the Christian does a very good job here just by clarifying, asking questions that really get, and we can understand where Alex is coming from specifically.
I like the claim. I got to come at it a little bit different approach because I think that the gospel writers are claiming that Jesus is God.
Sure.
Let's just go with Mark. As Mark starts, he talks about John the Baptist preparing the way for the Lord. Right. What is your response for that? Because ensuing Jesus comes.
I've no problem saying that Mark is intending to portray Jesus as God. It's not entirely clear, but I have no problem just granting that for the sake of this conversation. I think that the belief that Jesus is God is something that developed in early Christianity after Jesus died. I think there's nothing that Jesus said himself that can make us confidently say that he was walking around claiming to be God.
What do you need in order to believe that Jesus is God? Because even if we take kind of this development in the Gospels, we can go before that. So would you say Paul's letters like Philippians and Colossians, would you say they were written before the Gospels?
Yes, they were written before the Gospels.
So if we're going before the Gospels, we have Paul claiming that Jesus is God in Philippians 2, where he's saying was in the form of God, or maybe like a better translation would even be the essence or the nature of God.
Yeah, the problem I think with sort of quote mining in this respect is that there are quotes that point us in either direction, even in the Gospel of John. So Paul, for example, says that there is one God, which is the Father, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, seeming to separate them. Jesus says things like, my Father is greater than I am. He says things like, nobody knows the hour, not even the Son knows the hour, but only my Father in heaven. He says when he's crucified in the first two Gospels, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? I could point to these and say, these are Jesus claiming that he's separate from God.
Well, there is a distinction from the Father and the Son. So
Sure.
we're not, but instead of quote mining, I could just quote the whole thing. That though he was in the form of God, didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men.
Sure. So I also have no problem saying that Paul thought that Jesus was God.
Okay,
But
so
my assertion is that Jesus
that's actually
claimed to be
super
God.
clarifying for me, because then my question is, what piece of evidence do you now need in order to believe that Jesus claimed to be God? Like, what is it for you that you would be like, you know what, that convinces me?
Jesus, in his own words, saying that I am God.
Right, but he does that in John.
Where?
Before Abraham was, I am.
Sure, so before Abraham was, I am. For a start, as I've said, it only appears in the Gospel of John. We don't know if the
But
historical
he at least
Jesus
said it once, and the
But
claim
if
is that he never did.
If he actually said that, if he was going around claiming to be God in explicit terms,
That's a great...
why
yeah.
is it that none of the other Gospel writers thought it was a relevant detail to mention?
It's difficult to now deal with it because you are acknowledging...
Okay, pause. I'm so sorry.
Oh,
You've
no,
been
that's
voted
great.
out by
Hey,
Okay, well, first of all, I think the guy did a very good job, and he brings up something I want to highlight just a little bit later, but asking the question is a very good idea, and also the historicity of the different New Testament documents is very important to note kind of going forward. And then asking the question, what evidence do you need? What are you really looking for is a great way to go about things.
Good to see you again.
All right. Two things. Have you heard of the cloud rider motif?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Oh, the cloud rider motif. Yeah.
Okay. Then I'm assuming you've heard of like the two powers in heaven motif.
No.
Okay. There's a Jewish historian named Alan Segal. He wrote a book called The Two Powers in Heaven. And what he talks about is there's this weird thing happening in the Hebrew Bible where there's almost like two Yahweh figures that they point to. So some verses, for instance, will say like Yahweh rained down fire from Yahweh. And so Philo of Alexandria in the Second Temple period talks about this two powers in heaven motif. And he says like there's two Yahwehs. There's the first power and the second power, but they're both Yahweh. It's almost like a sort of proto-Trinitarian view. That's one thing that I'll just kind of put there for now. Another puzzle piece here is you've heard about the cloud rider motif. So in the Ugaritic texts, in the Baal cycle, we see Baal referenced as the one who rides the clouds. And I think you can see that actually adopted by the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible as well. So Psalm 104 is like an exaltation psalm and actually talks about Yahweh being the one that rides the clouds in heaven. He is the king. I see that as kind of a polemic of calling Yahweh the king over Baal. Are we on the same page there?
Sure.
Okay. In Daniel 7, you'll see a messianic passage there about how God will come down, and you'll see the Son of Man come, riding in the clouds of heaven, and his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom.
Do you think Daniel thought that the Son of Man was going to be God, since he says that he's riding on a cloud?
This is a really interesting point.
I
And
don't think that he did, because he was a Jewish writer.
I lean on saying yes, but I don't know if I can say
Do you
that with
think
like absolute certainty.
The
Is that
prophet
fair?
Daniel was expecting the Messiah to be God.
I think so.
Oh, sorry,
but
the Son of Man to be God.
who is that's a motif only applied to God. So you have this cloud rider motif and the human
By the way, I do think that there are multiple things which people, even in Jesus' time, thought only God could do. Things like forgiving sins. And when Jesus
Yeah.
does these things, he's not doing so in order to prove that he's God, but in order to prove that the Son of Man has the authority
Yeah,
to
I
do that
completely
too.
agree. I completely agree. This isn't that kind of an argument. This is an identification.
The guy gets street cred for having a very creative argument, but it is something that we need to highlight a little bit later as well. But this, it's a good angle to approach because I get the feeling he hasn't heard this one before.
Thing.
So where's Jesus claiming to
Yes,
be God?
that's where I'm going. So we have these puzzle pieces in place.
Sure.
If you fast forward to Mark's gospel, and I'm going to use Mark.
Let's do Mark.
Jesus before Caiaphas in Mark's gospel, Caiaphas asks him, "Who are you?" And instead of just explicitly saying, "I am God," Jesus quotes Daniel 7, saying he is the Son of Man, the human one,
Yep.
who will ride on the clouds and calls himself the second power. So you have this two powers in heaven motif. The two powers, they're both God, and the cloud rider motif and the Son of Man. He's quoting Daniel 7 to identify himself. After that, Caiaphas tears his robe and cries
Yes.
blasphemy.
I do think that Jesus is making some pretty extraordinary claims to himself, such as being the Son of Man, but I still don't see why he's claiming to be God. If this were the way that he was trying to reveal his divinity to people, it'd be a strange and convoluted way to do it. Psalm 82 also talks about God presiding over a council
Yeah.
of gods, saying,
So
you shall be called
I
gods.
think there's a mistake here,
And
'cause-
I quotes that psalm when he's referring to his relationship with the
I
Father
understand what you're
in the
saying.
Gospel of
The
John.
issue is-
So even if in the Old Testament you have these
two
sort of
hypotheses,
lesser
though,
gods,
right?
Jesus is
Your
only claiming to be that.
hypothesis, right? That this is not a Christological implication, and I have mine. And I get what you're saying, where you're coming from. But to the ancient author, how obvious would this be?
So the best we have here is Jesus claiming to be the Son of Man, and that might indicate that he might be God.
Yeah, well, we don't predicate our hypotheses on the evidence we wish we did have. We go off the evidence that we do have.
That's right. And I don't think that there's any point at which Jesus says,
So you're saying
I am
that this
God.
is not
All right,
evidence?
guys, that's time.
Evidence, but not good enough. Hey, so nice.
Evidence, but not good enough. His worst nightmare, right? Okay, so that gets into complexities. And imagine yourself as a Christian or sitting across from someone saying Jesus never claimed to be God. Okay, so I want to give a couple of things. Number one, and they kind of tie to what both of these people said. I think Alex O'Connor has a twofold problem. Number one is a history problem, and number two is a language problem. And I think a lot of us have the same thing. So the first one is he does make the case that he says, John is later. Okay, everybody agrees, or most scholars do agree, that when it comes to history of when things were written, the Gospels actually came after the epistles. That's what the first gentleman was getting to. So John is much later than, say, Mark. And Alex O'Connor kind of gives this idea that he looks at it, there's a progression of thought there. Mark, it's not nearly as clear, he's not nearly as divine, he might be something special, but he's not God. And then Mark later kind of gives this God-type language, that it progressed. But here's the problem with that. The Gospels being later, that automatically means the epistles are first, historically and chronologically. That's very important. The belief is that 1 Thessalonians is arguably the first one that we have, or the oldest one that we have. Now, one of the other things that, one of the great discoveries of modern New Testament scholarship is that inside these epistles are creeds of the early church. In other words, that predate the epistles themselves. There's one in Philippians. They refer to that one that does make the claim that Jesus is a great statement of Jesus claiming to be God. The other is in Colossians. You read Colossians chapter 1. It has what's called the Christ hymn, which is to me the most remarkable statement of Jesus' divinity in all of the Bible. And then you have what's considered by most scholars to believe the earliest statement of Christian belief on record. It's 1 Corinthians 15. It's a creed embedded inside that letter that some believe that goes back as far as 2 or 3 years after Jesus was on the earth. The point with that is that where did the belief come from? Number one, this stark of a belief that early. We know the Christians did believe that Jesus was God in the flesh very, very early on. And the language develops over time to where by the time you get to John, he's giving it language of Greek thought after they're out and everything else. And that's important a little bit later of what I want to say. Okay, so that's the first thing. There's a historical problem. There's no problem for this development of the divine because it was always there. It was like the resurrection. The Christians believed that the resurrection happened as far back as we can tell. Okay, now here's the important thing that I said I kind of agree with Alex O'Connor. And before I say this, I want to absolutely get this on record. I believe in Orthodox historic Christianity. Jesus is fully God and fully man. That is what Christians believe historically. I believe that. Be clear on that before I say anything else. Here's why I say I kind of agree with him. No, Jesus didn't go around claiming to be God. He didn't come up to people and say, hey, I'm Mr. God. You know, sometimes I like making elephants and fish aren't my favorite to make and all that kind of stuff. He never used that language because technically that's not his identity fully. But here is where the second guy kind of starts to get, he kind of goes about it a little bit different way. But in the end, what you have is, did you know that 80 times Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man? 80 different times. It was his favorite title for himself. That's what he's getting at. Jesus is the Son of Man, and that does believe, if you go back and read Daniel chapter 7, 13 and 14, just read it for yourself, and I'll give you the assignment of that. What you find is a man who is made divine. Now, he brings up well, do you think Daniel believed that? Well, it didn't make any difference what Daniel believed. It's what Jesus believed about himself. It was his favorite title because Jesus is pointing out that he is the God-man, because that's the idea. It's never going around just saying, I'm God and I make things, and as if the human part is irrelevant. Because it's absolutely relevant. That's why when you get in there and people throw you things like that, well, Jesus never claimed to be God, because he wouldn't use that kind of language. But he does do things that are absolutely divine. He's spoken of that way, even in Mark. My friend Braxton Hunter, who's in our network, he did a great job just kind of pointing out, in the Gospel of Mark, there's claims made about Jesus' divinity. That's why it's so difficult. But the reason it's never said that directly, it's because that's technically not correct. Who Jesus is he is fully God, fully man, and the best language for it is the famous thing that John says at the beginning of his gospel, is that in the beginning was the Word. The Greek word logos gave him language for that, logos, or message, communication, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, I wonder, like, why didn't he just come out and say Jesus was God? He didn't say it that way because, technically speaking, who Jesus is the communication of God that's with God, expresses God, but is God at the same time. That's their language for both things happening at once. Jesus was a man walking around revealing who God was as a man, walking around with experiencing what we experience, being what we are. using language like we use it. That's the entire point. Jesus is God's communication to all of us in fully human form. That's his identity. And so he's never going to say it that directly because, and that's why the early Christians didn't do that either. And that's why the New Testament does. But they all believed, and it's very obvious when you read the New Testament, they did believe that, and they wouldn't have believed something that off from who Jesus was going back that early. So history and language are very, very important to this thing, this whole question. And I hope that helps. I encourage you to check out, I mentioned my friend Braxton Hunter. He's in our network, has a lot of great answers to stuff like this. And he sat down with me to talk about Jesus' divinity and his resurrection. So check this out. Hope that helps. See you next time.